this is what to me makes Matthew one of the most interesting gospels to talk about in terms to authorship, because there's a lot of interesting problems. So we mentioned Matthew being a common name. We mentioned, and we'll come back to this, that Papias speaks of sayings of Jesus, not narrative, in Aramaic, not in Greek. But even so, for a moment, let's just assume, okay, Papias is talking about Matthew the Apostle, one of the 12, that he wrote the gospel that we have in our Bibles today. So let's just assume that that's true. There's then some debate about who Matthew the Apostle is, because our synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they don't all agree.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Thinking Theologically podcast, the show where we teach you how and why you should think theologically. I'm one of your hosts, Jack Dodgen, joined as always by the resident master theologian in training, Spencer Shaw.
There we go.
Got it.
It only took us a couple weeks. Only took us a few weeks of getting back to normal.
Oh, yeah. But we're here. We're here. We did it. Even on the little sleep, we are in tornado season in Oklahoma. So that means early morning watch parties for picking your weatherman of choice and waiting to see what will happen. So that's how I'm recording today. Thank goodness I'm just the guy in the seat and Spencer's
I gave up.
Show.
I gave up tornadoes for hurricanes.
Worse,
but
yeah, that's
but
worse.
we know them. We know about them way beforehand.
It's true,
which is positive. So it's a give and take kind of a thing. People ask me which one I prefer, and I'm like, I haven't experienced a full hurricane down here, so it's hard to say. But I was like, I do like the idea of like knowing days or weeks in advance and preparing for it, and not, well, we're gonna have some bad storms tonight. Could be a tornado. Oh, there's one right down the street. You better take shelter or whatever. I got more sleep than Jack, not as much as normal for a different reason. I don't know how much we've talked on the podcast about my basketball playing, but
not much. We've talked a lot about our respective like golf habits.
Golf is what I do a lot, but I also play a lot of basketball. I played in college, so I still enjoy playing as much as I can. Injured my Achilles a little over not quite a week ago, and so ended up not being quite as bad as we thought. Still going to be a few months worth of recovery though, so still some pain and discomfort and all that, but we're here because of you watching. That's listening, right. With no sleep, no left leg. I
preached from a chair for like half a year, dude. I had people bringing pillows to like set up. There's nothing more embarrassing than that for me, of like, I don't need these. Just please.
Yeah, I'll be preaching from a chair probably for at least a month. So not as long as you had to. So that's something.
That's, yeah. Glad the injury's not worse. Okay, if you're here, that means the last episode was intriguing enough that you're like, all right, we're talking about who wrote the Gospel of Mark. And so now we're moving into who wrote the Gospel of Matthew. The ordering is intentional, of beginning with Mark, and I think we'll have some of that discussion here. Though we've had discussion on the Synoptic Gospels and similarities and things like that in prior episodes and things, and those are all on thinkingtheologically.org, where you can go to get all of our previous episodes, as well as various things that we have written and put up there, and thinking about some more stuff in the future too. So make sure you check out thinkingtheologically.org for all of that stuff, and our Facebook page, Thinking Theologically, to get updated whenever those things post and all of this, and wherever you get your podcasts. So it seems like a lot of you are going to YouTube, at least for one episode in particular, which is great. So getting a lot of traction in a lot of different places. So Glad to hear all of that. Can't wait till we get big enough to maybe get canceled. That's what I'm looking forward to. Is I'm looking forward to some trouble. That's what I want. But not today. Who wrote the Gospel of Matthew is what we're dealing with. Today, moving along the lines of the Gospels here, eventually getting our way to Luke, which Spencer's talked about at length. That's his Gospel of choice, right? Yeah, that's
Yes.
the one. At least it's the
Yes.
one that you
I'm
know the
looking forward to
best.
that one. Though that one, in the grand scheme of things, is kind of boring authorship wise.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
I think, but we'll save that. That will be next episode. So
Worst for last. That's no, great. If that didn't sell you, I don't know what will. We're talking about Matthew's gospel today, though, and some similarities with what we discussed with the Mark gospel, but then some important additional information, I think, with this episode. I do want to remind you before we get going on where the name came from. 2 episodes ago, a very foundational episode for a lot of these discussions. So if you have not listened to, that would be episode 81. I don't remember the titling of it.
reading the Bible and understanding Christianity as story.
That's right. That was 2 episodes ago, and make sure you check that one out to get kind of the foundation of what we're doing here. Okay, like we started with Mark, where do we get the name Matthew from? Why is it called the Gospel of Matthew?
So we'll kind of begin and rehash a little bit of where we started in the last episode. So if you haven't seen the one on Mark, the first question that we addressed in that episode, which is kind of foundational for talking about authorship of the Gospels, is whether or not the Gospels were originally anonymous. And by that, we mean, did the original Gospel of Mark or Gospel of Matthew, did it have a name attached to it, Matthew, or the Gospel according to Matthew, or something like that? Or was it anonymous? Did it just begin like the Gospel of Mark begins, the beginning of the good news of Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God? And we talked about how most scholars believe that the Gospels were originally anonymous. I agree with that. We talked about the evidence for that. And so that's important just to kind of remind us as we begin thinking about the Gospel of Matthew. It began anonymous. So when it was originally written and circulated, it didn't have the name Matthew attached to it. So that's where this question of, okay, so if they were anonymous, where do we get this name Matthew from? And we get it from the same place that we get the name Mark from. So we have to go all the way back to Papias. Papias was the first one to attribute this gospel to someone named Matthew. Just a reminder, Papias lived in the 2nd century. So I mentioned with Mark, I date Mark around the year 70. Matthew was probably written in the mid to late 70s. So with Papias, we're talking about 40 to 60 years or something like that after Matthew was written. Papias is writing about who wrote these gospels, and so he's a little bit removed, but not as far removed as other people. But if you remember, we don't have the original writing of Papias. We have people quoting Papias. So again, you have Eusebius, who was writing at the beginning of the 4th century. So we're separated by 2 centuries, 200 plus years between Papias and Eusebius. And Eusebius is saying, this is what Papias said 200 years before me. So Jack mentioned in the last episode, we're talking about like degrees of separation here. And so Matthew was written, we'll say late 70s. Papias writes in the early 2nd century, so 120 to 140. And then Eusebius quotes Papias in the 300s, another 200 years later. And at this point, we're talking about 250 plus years after the gospel is written that you have Eusebius writing. And here's what Eusebius says. He said, Matthew compiled the sayings or logia of Jesus in the Hebrew dialect, and everyone interpreted them as he was able. This is what Eusebius says that Papias said. that Matthew compiled the sayings or the logia of Jesus. We'll come back to this idea, but that's important that Papias didn't say that Matthew wrote a narrative with stories like we have in our Gospel of Matthew in our canon today, but that Matthew compiled sayings, logia of Jesus, and that he did them in the Hebrew dialect. Now, scholars aren't quite sure what Eusebius or what Papias meant by the Hebrew dialect. That could be the Hebrew language. And so some scholars would say that Papias is talking about a gospel written in Hebrew. Others would say Aramaic because the majority of Hebrew people and Jesus himself most likely taught and spoke in Aramaic in the first century, not in Hebrew. And so if we're talking about the common language of the Hebrew people, so a language that the average person could understand, you'd be talking about Aramaic. And to me, that makes the most sense because if you're writing down a gospel or sayings or whatever, you want the most number of Jews to be able to understand it and not just the highly educated, or maybe what we would call today Jewish scholars that could, or priests that could still read in Hebrew. You would probably want your average Jew to be able to understand it. And if that's the case, you'd write in Aramaic. But add that to, if scholars are correct, if we're correct to assume that Jesus spoke in Aramaic, then what would be written down would be the exact Aramaic sayings of Jesus. So our Gospels today are in Greek, which meant that any sayings in the Greek Gospels that go back to Jesus would be translations. Jesus would have spoke about them in Aramaic. They then get translated into Greek. I'll have more to say on that as we go on as well. But for those two reasons, the fact that Jesus would have spoke them in Aramaic and that the average Jew in the first century seems to have spoken Aramaic, that makes the most sense. And so what Papias is saying is that this man by the name of Matthew put together sayings of Jesus in Aramaic, the original dialect of Jesus. And what's interesting is that this tradition was never challenged, which is kind of important just to mention that throughout history since Papias, no one challenged and said, well, it wasn't Matthew, it was this other guy. This what has been consistently the tradition that the gospel was written by a man named Matthew, which is why to this day it is titled the Gospel of Matthew. Eventually, our current gospel gets associated with Matthew, one of the 12, or one of the apostles. So we see that, for example, in Irenaeus, who lived at the end of the second century, as well as Origen, who lived in the third century, all speak of our gospel as written by Matthew, one of the 12 apostles. Now, what's important is that it seems Irenaeus and Origen and Eusebius are all dependent on Papias for saying this. So they're not independently saying Matthew wrote it. It's Irenaeus, 50 years after Papias, or whatever it might have been, relying on Papias and saying it was Matthew the apostle. Because one thing you have to note is that Papias doesn't say what Matthew we're talking about. And Matthew, like Mark, was a popular name. There were a lot of people named Matthew. And so we don't know for sure what Matthew Papias is talking about. He just says a dude by the name of Matthew wrote down sayings in Aramaic. And then later on, Irenaeus, Origen, Eusebius say, well, what Papias is talking about is this gospel. And they would have, they didn't do this, but they would have said, laid out the gospel that we have in our Bibles today. This gospel is what Papias is talking about. And the Matthew he is talking about is Matthew, one of the 12 apostles. And so they're all dependent on Papias, but it's never challenged. Everyone after Papias ends up attributing our current gospel to Matthew and identify Matthew as one of the 12 apostles, even though we don't know for certain if this is the Matthew that Papias is talking about. But remember, again, if you didn't watch Mark, we talked about this in depth as well. It was important in the early life of the church as they're figuring out what Christian works are going to be authoritative, what are inspired by God, what breathe life as the canon begins to be developed. it was important to trace these works back to an apostle. So these attributions of saying the Matthew Papias is talking about is the apostle, it is a little biased. It doesn't mean it's incorrect, but we just have to recognize as we're evaluating this information that they are a little biased because they're wanting to attribute the gospels that they're using or the gospels that they believe to be inspired, the gospels that are life-giving, they want to attribute those to the apostles. And so there is a little biases going on there, but not in a negative or hateful way. We talked about that a little bit in the next episode. Kind of these discussions bring to mind that we'll probably have to do an episode in the future about how the canon came together and talk about that a little bit more. There weren't nefarious purposes that people were trying to keep gospels in and other gospels out.
Right.
That doesn't neglect the fact that there are biases at work, but that's just human nature. You can't completely rid yourself of biases, but it doesn't mean that there is nefarious reasons going on. So that's how we get the name Matthew. It's kind of convoluted. You have kind of steps in the process, and there's a lot of things that we're uncertain about, but that is why in our Bibles today it's called the Gospel of Matthew.
And you mentioned it here, but I want to bring it up again with the writings that are life-giving and all of that. It's not accepted as true because Matthew's name is assigned to it, though obviously that doesn't hurt those things. But it is unlike a Gospel of Thomas, for example. The messaging and all of this stuff was not consistent with what you saw with the other witnesses and other writers and things like that. So again, it's this focus on whether or not we know exactly who the author is. It is the content where the faith should be placed, the message, and where it leads us, and all of those things. So, but I think we'll have more to say about that as we go through. Okay, so we know where Matthew's name comes from, but then the question, and you've already said this, Matthew being a popular name, is not particularly a unique name. Are we talking about Matthew or Levi the tax collector? Explain this issue.
Yeah, so this is what to me makes Matthew one of the most interesting gospels to talk about in terms to authorship, because there's a lot of interesting problems. So we mentioned Matthew being a common name. We mentioned, and we'll come back to this, that Papias speaks of sayings of Jesus, not narrative, in Aramaic, not in Greek. But even so, for a moment, let's just assume, okay, Papias is talking about Matthew the apostle, one of the 12, that he wrote the gospel that we have in our Bibles today. So let's just assume that that's true. There's then some debate about who Matthew the apostle is, because our synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they don't all agree on whether Matthew was a tax collector, whether Matthew was also named Levi. So there's some dispute about the name of Matthew the apostle. There's some dispute about what his job was. And there's some dispute, as Jack pointed out while we were getting ready for this episode, about the family that Matthew comes from. And so what's interesting is, even if we want to say, okay, it was written by Matthew the apostle, we're not quite sure who this guy is because the Gospels don't quite agree about it. So I want to run through what I mean when I say that here. So in Mark chapter 2, Jesus is beginning his ministry, and he calls a tax collector named Levi to come and follow him. And this is a story like what we get with James and John, for example, of a normal calling of someone who becomes a part of the 12. Now, it's important to realize that Jesus had other disciples around him that weren't a part of the 12. We're told that of his disciples, Jesus set apart 12 that become called apostles. That's the way the story goes. So just because Jesus calls someone to come and follow him makes this person a disciple, not necessarily one of the 12 apostles. And I think that's important to realize. But in Mark chapter 2, Jesus calls this tax collector named Levi to come and follow him. There's a parallel account in Matthew 9, which reads the exact same way. It relies on Mark's account. So Matthew used the Gospel of Mark in the writing of his version because he copies a lot of it word for word from Mark. However, in Matthew's account, the tax collector is not named Levi. The tax collector is named Matthew. So in Mark and in Luke, you have this tax collector named Levi. In Matthew, the tax collector's name is changed to Matthew. You continue reading. In Mark chapter 3, Jesus appoints the 12, and one of them is named Matthew. We just have this guy named Matthew, one of the 12. In Matthew's account, in chapter 10, one of the 12 is called Matthew the tax collector. So Matthew identifies the Matthew in the 12 as the tax collector, which for Matthew is to connect back to that story where Jesus calls him to come and follow him. So if you remember, Matthew has Matthew the tax collector that Jesus calls to follow him. And then in one of the 12, there's a guy, Matthew the tax collector. So Matthew is connecting these two stories. He's saying this man, who's part of the 12, was the tax collector that Jesus called to follow him in the previous chapter. And so there's some discrepancy about, well, what is this guy's name? Is it Matthew or is it Levi? It's Levi in Mark and Luke. It's Matthew in Matthew. There's debate then about, well, is this guy one of the 12? Because you would think that if Mark and Luke believe that this tax collector is one of the 12, they would have called him Levi when they list the apostles and not Matthew to connect these two stories together, which is not what they do. It's what Matthew does. So Matthew connects the tax collector that's called to Matthew in the list of the apostles. And so we're kind of left to wonder, not only what is this guy's name, but is he the tax collector that Jesus called? And we're even kind of left to wonder, is this guy a tax collector? Because Mark and Luke don't say that he's a tax collector. Only Matthew says that the Matthew in the apostles is the tax collector. But also, and Jack, you can step in here in a second as well, because you were the one that pointed this out, is that Levi, correct me if I'm wrong, is identified as the son of Alphaeus.
In Mark 2.
And in the apostles, list of the apostles, we have someone who's the son of Alphaeus, but it's James. And so
in Mark
Jack
3,
mentioned, is James like a brother of Levi, or is Levi also James?
So
and
would he also be Matthew then too?
Also, would he also be Matthew? And so there's some questions even about his family lineage. And again, you could also say, well, maybe there's another Alphaeus. And so this is the way that people have tried to explain them, is that people have said, well, Matthew was also called Levi. So we say he had two names, and which is possible.
Sure.
My issue with that is that I just find it interesting that Mark and Luke don't connect the stories. I would think that if they understand this Matthew as one of the 12 as being the one called earlier, they would connect them and say, oh yeah, by the way, you've already heard about this guy. And only Matthew does that, which is a weird thing to do. Again, like I said, you could say, well, maybe there's another Alphaeus. Maybe this is the brother of Levi. So we also don't know about the family. There's just a lot of weird things that are going on in the stories about Matthew the Apostle that we're not even from the text quite sure who this guy is, what family he's a part of, what his profession is, and how he meets Jesus.
Yeah, I think there's even one more wrinkle there with all this too, because it's Levi, son of Alphaeus in Mark 2. Mark 3 with the listing of the 12, it's Matthew. And then after that, I think right after, is James, son of Alphaeus. And Matthew's identifying of the 12 has Matthew, the tax collector, and it also has James, the son of Alphaeus. So there are ways you can connect that name to Mark, but then if you're going to do that, then you either have to say James is also Levi or some other but it's not Matthew. So it gets really weird. The longer you stare at it, like the more you say a word, it sounds less like a word. So the longer you look at it, the more confusing it gets.
And I want to add this just real quickly, just to kind of give an explanation of maybe what's going on here. And this doesn't have to mean that there's a contradiction. That's a debate for a different episode about how the historical nature of the Gospels work. I've written on that before, and a lot of people didn't like it. So I'm going to try not to
Sure.
step on my already injured foot. Um, but what could be going on here is some of these lesser known apostles, which Matthew is one of them. We'll come back to that. James is one of them. So in the Christian tradition, James, the brother of Jesus, becomes important in the Jerusalem church,
Yeah.
but not James the apostle. And so some of these lesser known apostles, which is interesting that they don't take a prominent role in the early church, at least in the documents that we have. It's a discussion for a different episode as well. But it's possible that these lesser known apostles, as the tradition is handed down, likely orally at first, that it kind of gets muddled. There kind of gets some confusion. Some things get lost or misunderstood or forgotten because nobody's talking about these guys, right? We're not talking about someone like Peter that everybody knows and becomes important in the early church. It's guys that nobody ever talks about. And so what I think is just happening here is that the tradition gets a little muddled because you're trying to remember and figure out things about people that nobody really knows about. And so there becomes some confusion. Now, like I said, it's perfectly fine if you want to say, well, there's a way to work it out. I would say we can't know that now. We can pose some theories that go way beyond the text. I don't think there's any way for us to figure out how to harmonize all that right now. But it's perfectly fine to say there is a way. Maybe there is a way. Maybe there's not a way.
Sure.
But I think there's just kind of some muddying of the tradition that's going on here because they're guys that are unimportant. They're just kind of throwaway characters, really, because they never show back up. They're just kind of, well, Jesus called 12, which is important that he had 12.
Yes.
But they're not really that concerned about most of the names of these people because
Right.
they're just kind of throwaway characters.
To that point, for like before we get into this next question, an Old Testament equivalent might be something like Elijah and Elisha, and there were some other named prophets. But then you also had a man of God. There were these nameless prophets that were running around doing the work that Elijah was doing the work that Elisha, sharing the word of God, is trying to steer the people of God back to him. And we have no idea who they are. And their names do not matter. It's what they're doing that matters. And so this would be a similar kind of thing of the man of God going and doing, or woman of God, the person of God going and doing the work of God. What's their name? Doesn't really matter. It's about the kingdom and moving it forward. Okay, so scholars, where do they land on all of this? Do they think Matthew the apostle wrote the gospel?
This probably won't surprise you, but no, the scholarly consensus is not that it is that Matthew the apostle did not write the current gospel that we have in our New Testament. And there are a couple of reasons for this, and I want to list just a few of the most common ones here. The first is that Matthew copies sections of Mark word for word. We'll talk about that more in a future episode when we talk about the synoptic problem, but it's believed by scholars, I believe this myself, that Matthew used and copied from Mark in the composition of his gospel. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One of the reasons is just because of what we know about writing and research and things from the ancient world. That fits very well with the way that other documents that are not the same, but similar to the Gospels were written. But it's also, you just think about if Jack and I were writing a paper on the same subject and we turned in this term paper, you would expect there to be some overlap because we're writing about the same subject. We're going to tell some of the same stories, probably have a similar order in the way that we write things out. But there's going to be differences, right? Because we're going to write in our own voice and our own style. Jack's going to emphasize things that I won't, vice versa. But if a professor gets these term papers and looks at them, and there's whole sections that agree word for word, we're not just telling the same story, but we're telling it with the same words. It would be obvious somebody copied off of somebody. And there's no way to know in that case, did Jack copy off of me or did I copy off of him? And that's what you get in the Gospels. If there's sections of Matthew that they're not just telling the same story as Mark, but they're doing so with the exact same wording. And since we believe that Mark was written first, then the belief is that Matthew is using Mark. And I say all that to say we'll in a future episode make an argument more in depth about why that's the case. That's just my brief little argument here. But that's a very odd thing to do if you were an eyewitness, which Matthew supposedly is. It's an odd thing if you were an eyewitness not to recount your own eyewitness version, but to copy from someone else. Now, you might use another document to help remind you of what happened, but it's an odd thing to copy from it. Here's the even odder thing is if we're talking about Matthew, the tax collector, then he copies his own conversion story, which is an even stranger thing to do. If there's anything that you remembered about your interaction with Jesus, it was probably your first interaction with him when he called you to follow him. Why would you copy your own conversion story? That's a very strange thing to do. 90% of Mark's gospel is used in Matthew. And so Matthew copies almost the entirety of Mark's gospel and then expands it. So Matthew is very much, and Luke as well, an expansion of Mark's gospel. And I think that's probably what they were doing. Something else with this is that eyewitness testimony was invaluable to people in the ancient world. That's still kind of the case today. We like eyewitness testimony, even though in today's world, we understand that it can be very unreliable. We still want eyewitness testimony. So in court, eyewitness testimony is still important. And so ancient historians who were eyewitnesses always made this fact known. They wanted to know, I am an eyewitness to these events. I was there because that was important. And so it's also odd that nowhere in the Gospel of Matthew does the author state that he is an eyewitness. If he was, and eyewitness testimony was important, you would expect somewhere along the way for him to say, oh yeah, by the way, I was an eyewitness to these events. But we don't get that anywhere in the gospel. The second reason is that the gospel was written in Greek, not Aramaic. Remember, Papias said that Matthew wrote down the sayings of Jesus in the Hebrew dialect, which we are going to interpret as Aramaic. There is no internal evidence to suggest that it was translated from Aramaic into Greek. Now, there are scholars who disagree with that. A minority of scholars think that the Gospel of Matthew was originally written in Hebrew or in Aramaic, and then it was translated into Greek. The scholarly consensus, though, is that that did not happen, and at least the evidence that I see, there's no suggestion that the Gospel of Matthew is a Greek translation of an Aramaic or a Hebrew original. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One, the Greek is very polished, which is generally not the case for a translation. It tends to be a little bit bumpy, and there's a couple of reasons for it. One is awkward phrasing. So when you try to translate a concept from one language into another, there's not always an easy way to do that. And so you get some awkward phrasing. And there's really no awkward phrasing in the Gospel of Matthew that suggests that there's a translation that's happening here. Let me give you an example of how that works. So when you read about the resurrection of Jesus, all the Gospels use the language of on the first day of the week. And we still use that today. Jesus was raised on the first day of the week. I don't know if you've ever thought about this very much, but that is literally the longest way to say Sunday. The worst way to say Sunday is on the first day of the week. Why not say Sunday? Why not? Why do we have the phrase on the first day of the week? The best explanation is that on the first day of the week makes a lot of sense in Aramaic. When it gets
Mm.
translated from Aramaic, which would have been the language of Jesus, and so probably the first proclamation that Jesus was raised was in the Aramaic language, and they use this phrase first day of the week, and they keep that phrase and you just use it in Greek when the gospels are being written. They keep the original phrase that was first proclaimed about Jesus being raised. But when that Aramaic phrase gets translated into Greek, it becomes a little clunky. It becomes on the first day of the week. And then we translate that into English, and it remains clunky on the first day of the week, but it's not clunky in Aramaic. And so that's what I mean by kind of clunky or awkward phrases that you get when you're trying to translate things from one language to another. And you don't really get that in the Gospel of Matthew, with the exception of some of these phrases that we find in all of the Gospels, like on the first day of the week, which seem to be these phrases that go back to the historical Jesus, that go back to early Christian proclamation, and that are kept. So, like in Paul's letters, Abba, Father, which is Abba is the Aramaic term for father, and then you get pater, the Greek term for father. So it's father, father, just in two different languages. The Abba goes back to Jesus. When Jesus refers to God as Father, as an Aramaic speaker, he would have used the term Abba, and so that kind of carries over. So you get some of that in these phrases that are carried over kind of in all the Gospels and all the traditions that we get. Important phrases like on the first day of the week, like Father. But other than that, you don't really see a lot of that in the Gospel of Matthew, which would be strange if it was a translation. When quoting from the Old Testament, it seems that Matthew follows the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, which would be a strange thing to do if you were writing in Aramaic, because then you'd have to translate from the Greek Septuagint back into Aramaic, and then that would be translated back into Greek, and it wouldn't look like you were following the Greek Old Testament. Also, a lot of the syntax, the wordplay, the literary conventions in Matthew are Greek and would not work in Aramaic. So literary conventions, the way that you string words together, the syntax that you use, it's different for different languages. And most of what Matthew is doing fits very well in Greek. It would not fit very well in Aramaic. So it just seems very unlikely that our current Gospel of Matthew is a translation and that it was originally composed in Greek. So at the minimum, it seems that the current gospel we have is not the one that Papias was talking about, because it was not, there's no evidence to suggest it was originally written in Aramaic, unless we say that Papias was incorrect. So either Papias was incorrect, that it was originally written in Aramaic, or he's not talking about our current gospel, or there's a third option that I've seen thrown around before, not very common, but that Matthew was originally written in Greek and then translated into Hebrew. And that Hebrew translation is what Papias is talking about. That's another option. Here's my point, is that there's a lot of separation between what Papias says and the current gospel we have. We either have to say Papias is talking about something different, Papias got the Aramaic wrong, which doesn't make sense to me, because it seems like he knows of an Aramaic version of some gospel, like he's seen it, he's read it. Or it was written in Greek and then translated back into Aramaic, which is also kind of a strange thing. Something else just to point out is that Papias also says that what Matthew wrote were the logia, or the sayings of Jesus, which are typically used, that word is typically used not to refer to a narrative, but to just Jesus said this, and then Jesus said this, and then Jesus said that, without much context. I would encourage you to go and just Google and look up the Gospel of Thomas, a likely 2nd century gospel. That's a sayings gospel. There's no context. It's literally Jesus said, Jesus said, Jesus said, Jesus said. That is likely what Papias is talking about. Using the word logia or sayings would be a strange way to describe the gospel as we have it. It would fit a lot better with the list of sayings like we have in the Gospel of Thomas, which is another reason to suggest that what Papias is talking about and what he's familiar with is not the gospel that we have in our New Testament. And if that's the case, then Papias connecting it to Matthew is absolutely unhelpful for the question of authorship.
Fair enough. Okay, so those are all the reasons why uh not yeah that have been put forth as to why, okay, not Matthew the apostle. That being said, there are some arguments for in favor of Matthew the apostle writing this particular book. Um, a few here, actually, it looks like. So, why the debate? What are some arguments in favor here of Matthew?
So, one of the classical ones that you might read in a common commentary, like a lower level one, not like a Scott, or you might hear in a Bible class or something like that, is the degree of specificity used to refer to Roman and Judean coinage. Some people see some more specific words used to refer to coins. And they say, well, that makes sense because Matthew was a tax collector. Um, there's a lot of problems with that. Jack and I could sit here and talk to you about American coins. It doesn't mean we're bankers. Like it doesn't mean that we mint the coins because we know some. There's a lot of people that also collect coins today that can tell you a lot more than Jack and I can, a
Mhm.
lot more specific than even we find in the Gospel of Matthew. It doesn't mean that their profession has anything to do with coins. So even if we say, yeah, the gospel is more specific about coinage, it's a stretch to then say, well, then Matthew had to be a tax collector. That I'll just say that doesn't really work, but that's an argument that's put forward. One of the other ones goes back to the name discrepancy, that the reference to Matthew the tax collector in Matthew chapter 10, rather than to merely Matthew as in Mark. So some see, well, the reason that Matthew changes the name from Levi to Matthew, the reason that Matthew calls Matthew in the 12 a tax collector, which the other gospels do not do, and the reason that he connects the two stories together is because he's the author. He wants you to know that this conversion story is his story, that it's the story of this person in the 12, which is not connected in Mark or Luke. Again, bit of a stretch because Jack and I have talked about there's more problems than just that going on with the list of the 12. And so that's also a bit of a stretch, possible, but a bit of a stretch. Here's where we get into arguments that make a little bit more sense. The first is that why would someone choose Matthew? We kind of said the same thing about Mark. If you were making someone up, why Matthew? Well, Matthew, an apostle, which was important. We've talked about that. But Matthew was a very unimportant apostle, as seen in it appears that there was some discrepancies in the tradition about what this guy's name even was, what family he was from, what his profession was. Very unimportant and forgotten apostle. So if you were making up an apostle, you wouldn't choose Matthew. You choose Peter, or you choose John, or maybe you choose James. You choose someone who is a lot more well known than Matthew. He's not a name you would expect someone to make up. Regarding Matthew's use of Mark, some have said that by the time Matthew is writing, Mark is well known among the churches. It's been circulated. A lot of Christians are familiar with the Gospel of Mark. And so rather than reinventing that part of the wheel, Matthew just chooses to use Mark. Instead of just starting from scratch, he uses Mark and he expands it. And so that's why we get a lot of the exact same language used. And the reason that maybe Matthew did this is because his primary aim is not historiography. So what Matthew is trying to do is not primarily to write down his eyewitness historical testimony, but it's spiritual formation of church communities. He's trying to spiritually form followers of Jesus into the people that God desires them to be. And so maybe his idea was, well, I'm not going to reinvent the wheel, I'll just expand what's already been done. Now, one of the problems with that is if that's the case, you would expect the parallel stories in Mark and Matthew to almost always be just direct copies. And they're never direct copies. Matthew is always changing a little bit, maybe just polishing it up, adding things, changing things. And so there's always some small changes. And if he's just not trying to invent the wheel, you would expect some of those small changes in other places, like in his own story or something like that. I think you would also expect the author to say, hey, I was an eyewitness to these things and they're true, even if he's copying from Mark of saying, yeah, this is correct. And we just don't get any of that, which makes that one a little bit more of a stretch. If we want to connect the gospel to Matthew the apostle, here's the best way to do it. So another way around these problems is to suggest that Matthew did write down a list of Jesus' sayings in Aramaic. So Papias is right. There were a list of sayings of Jesus in Aramaic by Matthew the apostle. These sayings were possessed by the communities that Matthew was involved with, that he led, that he taught. Maybe these were copied and spread throughout other communities, but they were available to communities of Christians. Eventually, a disciple of Matthew, or maybe someone who just had this list of sayings that Matthew wrote, took the list, took the Gospel of Mark that had been circulated by this point, and other sources, maybe other eyewitnesses, maybe Q that we've talked about before and we'll talk about in future episodes, took together all these sources, much like Luke says that he did, went and did all of this research, and composed the Greek gospel that we have today, which is more complete than any of these sources on their own. And so what that would mean is we can trace some of the sayings back to Matthew, but not all of it. That someone took these sayings that Matthew the apostle wrote down, they took the Gospel of Mark, they took other sources like we know that Luke did, and brought those together and wrote the Greek gospel that we have. One thing that might be in support of this is that the things that are unique to the Gospel of Matthew, that are not found in Mark and that are not found in Luke, those unique sayings tend to be in the teaching sections of Jesus. So in Matthew, there are 5 teaching sections of Jesus, which mirror the 5 books of the law or the Torah: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, because something that Matthew is doing is he's connecting Jesus to Moses. And so the unique portions of Matthew tend to be found in those 5 teaching sections. And so they tend to be sayings of Jesus, which could lend credence to, well, maybe there was a sayings gospel that Matthew the apostle wrote. Maybe that was used in the composition of Matthew, which is why we get this unique Matthean material in the sayings of Jesus. It's a possibility. I think it's a bit of a stretch, and we'll talk about this as we continue through, just because, again, we're having to kind of create these kind of grandiose scenarios that go beyond a lot of the evidence that we have. Again, that's not to say that's not the case. Something happened that gave us this gospel. And so we kind of have to go beyond, at some point, the historical evidence we have to come up with some scenario. But again, is this the simplest and easiest scenario? Is it the most likely? I'm not sure. It is a possibility, though, at least if we want. And I think the best possibility, if we want to connect this gospel to the apostle Matthew.
Okay. The only thing I want to say here before we look at what we get from internal evidence is yeah, I don't know how many people. I assume most people think um, the authorship of a book is just pretty straightforward and simple. And it's not. There's we're talking about books with Mark and Matthew that don't have a I Matthew wrote this kind of language, and even some of the letters later on that do have that still have some, okay, which exactly, who exactly is that person, or all of this. And then the lengths that people might go to in trying to figure out, okay, it's possible that it was Matthew if we have this, that, or the other thing, and do it. And again, just this reminder of these things as they were being, as it was written and then shared and spread, and all of that was read among the churches and copied and passed around and all of this, and they, uh, those that heard it, knew, okay, this is what the apostles taught. This is truth. This is, Spencer's phrase of life giving. This is what the church needs, to be who we're supposed to be. There's miraculous involvement of the Holy Spirit involved in all of that discussion too, among the early church at the very least. So, uh, adding into all of that, but it is the message, that's contained within, the writings, and not the author, itself, that matters, the most here.
That's a real good comment that you make. And I think it's important that we realize that at the end of the day, the Holy Spirit authored these, was involved in the process. It doesn't matter all that much who wrote them, outside of the point that we've kind of made before of the role that it might play in interpretation or maybe shouldn't play in interpretation.
Mm.
Historical questions for scholars that a lot of us aren't concerned with, but also kind of like we talked about and hit on a lot in our last episode. What's most important is people's faith and not building a faith on a weak foundation that, well, my faith is in Jesus is only because Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote them. If they didn't write them, then I can't be a believer. I can't have faith. And the problem with that is that if we build people's faith on that, then they get introduced to the history that we know and what we do know, which is not very much, and some of the problems with some of the traditional authorship, then people's faith get destroyed. But in a healthy context among believers like this, like in a church, if we can talk about these things and if we can build our faith on Jesus and the work of the Holy Spirit in these books and not on questions like authorship, then we don't run that risk of people's faith being destroyed when they get on TikTok or YouTube or go off to school or wherever they might be introduced to friends in a cafeteria, all these different places where you can be introduced to some of these problems, especially in our world today where information is so readily available. There's people talking about this. I see it all the time on social media. And we want to just kind of be the voice of faith into this and be kind of a safe space to talk about some of these things that at the end of the day, both Jack and I think that the Holy Spirit inspired,
Mhm.
regardless of who might or might not have actually written them.
Yeah, and we've had those conversations before. This is not a question about, is this an inspired writing? That's not what we're talking about at all. It's who is the author. We may, and we have, this is what we've talked about before, refining the definition of what we mean when we say inspiration. But God written, is ultimately what we're dealing with here. Now, how all of that came to be exactly, there's, I think, room for discussion on all of that, and even some disagreement on all of those things. But yeah, this is not a question of should we keep reading Matthew. No, it's a question of maybe Matthew didn't write it, but yeah, you should keep reading it, especially because it traces Jewish history, as you said just a little while ago. The way that it's laid out, it's a great book. Okay, what do we know from internal evidence about the author? What do we know about this individual?
Kind of like we talked about with Mark, there's not a ton that we can know. We can know that the author's educated because they're able to read and write, which most of I think the highest scholarly thoughts are like 10% of early Christians were able to read and write. So
Okay.
an educated person, because most would not have been able to read and write. It's good polished Greek, as we've talked about. It's kind of a smoothing over and editing of Mark, which is not Mark's well written, but not as well written as Matthew. And so someone who has education and writing skills, as both Jack and I have talked about the connection to Jewish history and to the Old Testament, to Moses, the author is most likely a Jewish Christian because of some of that knowledge, the heavy uses of the Old Testament. There's uses of Jewish literary techniques. An example would be the 3 sets of 14 generations in Jesus' genealogy that open it up. Those sets of 14, that's a Jewish thing. And so you would tend to expect, well, a Jewish Christian would incorporate that Jewish literary technique into the way that they write their gospel. That's something that you might expect. You also see, as we've talked about, the knowledge about Jewish customs, about Jewish laws, Jesus' 5 teaching sections, which reflect the 5 books of Moses or the Torah in the Old Testament. You just see it's so steeped in Old Testament that it could have been a Gentile, could have been a God-fearing Gentile who had been a part of the Jewish people for an extended period of time. That's always possible, but it seems most likely that the author is a Jewish Christian and is using that Jewish heritage and Old Testament scripture in the way that he chooses to tell the story of Jesus. I would also say it's likely that they are a second generation Christian and not an eyewitness. Again, that's a little bit debatable, as we've talked about, but the fact that the author never mentions that they're an eyewitness, the use of Mark, what I believe is the use of Q, which is also debatable. We'll talk about that in a future episode as well. But the use of other sources and not mentioning that you're an eyewitness, for me, forces me to question, well, maybe this is a second generation Christian, like with Mark, someone who wasn't there from the beginning. Maybe they use sources and people. They go back to the beginning, maybe even a sayings gospel written by the Apostle Matthew. But the internal evidence to me suggests a second generation educated Jewish Christian.
Okay. So all of this, all the arguments laid out, and all of the history of the naming and things like that, and our internal evidence, all of this. Who do you think wrote Gospel of Matthew?
So my, I guess, controversial opinion, maybe, I don't know, is the furthest that I would want to say is what I just said. I think a second generation Jewish Christian wrote the Gospel of Matthew. I think that makes the most sense of the internal evidence that we have. I think that makes the most sense of the problems of the external evidence. So the problem with it's connected to Matthew because of what Papias said, but it's really difficult, if not impossible, to trace what Papias said to our current gospel because of the sayings, because of the Aramaic. It's just, that's difficult. I think that there is a possibility that something of it goes back to Matthew, just because, like I said, Matthew's not a name that you made up. So I think there, at least I would say there's probably something to what Papias says about Matthew writing something about Jesus. It seems that there is likely some truth there. But whether or not that has any bearing on our current gospel, that's where things kind of start to break down. It's very hard to trace what Papias said, even if we want to say, okay, Papias is right. Matthew wrote down some sayings of Jesus in Aramaic. It's almost impossible to then trace that to the current gospel that we have. That's where things kind of break down. So I would want to say there's some decent evidence that what Papias is talking about is true. I'm not sure there's much evidence to trace that to our current gospel, though, I mentioned there are better ways to do that than others. But I'm not sure there's enough evidence for me to say, yeah, I think Matthew in some way played a role in getting the gospel that we have now, though, like I said, it's always possible. So I would want to just say, and in my interpretation of Matthew, not go beyond saying a second generation. Maybe you even want to say first generation, but I don't think there's evidence for that. A second generation Jewish Christian wrote it. That's about the extent of what I think we can know. But like I said, that's debatable. There's other ways to work through it. And we've tried in this episode to lay out what some of those are. Again, everything was not exclusive. We didn't list every reason to reject Matthean authorship. We didn't list every reason to believe that Matthew wrote the gospel either, but tried to lay down some of the more common ones so that partly so that you can make kind of the decision of, well, who do you think wrote it based upon what we talked about? Even though we want to say the Holy Spirit was ultimately the author, who do you think wrote it? And to try, myself not to be too biased and only list, well, here's all the reasons that he didn't. Well, no, there are some reasons maybe to think that it's a development of something that Matthew did at the very least.
I think it's Matthew because the title of my Bible says it's Matthew. Um, was that a controversial opinion from Spencer? Let us know. Please do it in a nice way. But you can let us know pretty well anywhere. You can get a hold of me or him on Facebook or at our Facebook page or at strongchurchministries@gmail.com if you want to reach out through email. And then you can get a hold of Spencer pretty well anywhere on the internet that has social features. So maybe even game chats somewhere, kind of like the Luka Doncic thing. You're just playing Overwatch secretly.
I'm all over the interwebs,
There you
so
go.
you just find me.
But let us know what you think. I'm not. This is not a guarantee, but Luke might be next here as far as
Yes.
our discussion goes. As we've already laid out, the most boring of these episodes. So only downhill from here, everyone. But we hope to see you
Hey,
next time.
after Luke, we return back for John, which
Hey,
is
yeah,
another
that's right.
very interesting one.
There
But
you go.
Luke is kind of straightforward. So, if you think everything I've said up to this point is controversial, watch Luke because it won't be.
There we go.
Luke's a little bit more
The
traditional.
the palate cleanser discussion before we get
I'm
into
not a complete heretic.
we're
Watch
not
the Luke
complete.
episode.
Not complete.
Just
Well,
partial.
we'll see you next time for that episode on Luke and our future episodes in this discussion. I'm Jack, and that's Spencer. We'll see you next time.